Hey there, welcome to Book Overflow. This is the podcast for software engineers by software engineers dedicated to improving our craft by reading and discussing the best technical books in the world. I am Carter Morgan, and I'm joined here, as always, by my co-host, Nathan Toups. How are you doing, Nathan?
I'm doing great. Looking forward to this one too.
Me too. This is a bit of a different book this week. We'll get into it. I just want to do a couple of housekeeping notes. We just went live last week with our first 3 episodes. They're on YouTube, they're on Spotify, we're on pretty much every major podcasting platform. And if we're not, we have an RSS feed, so you can subscribe to us there. If you like what you're hearing, please like, subscribe, follow, leave a comment. This is the very early stages of the podcast, and so your input could really determine the direction of this. And we've just been so thrilled by the reception of everyone who has subscribed and who has liked. It really means a lot. We kind of started this just because we wanted to read the books and we wanted kind of an accountability buddy, and to see so many people interested in the books as well and interested in improving their craft. It really means a lot, and we're so excited to have you along for the journey. And if you'd like to be even more along for the journey, please look at bookoverflow.io. You can see our public book schedule there of every episode or every book we will be covering and what dates we'll be covering them. We promise to stick 90% to the schedule. We cannot promise that it will never diverge, but it is there. It is an iframe of a Google Sheet, and I will defend that decision until I die. I think there's actually a lot of smart engineering reasons to have something that simple. We can discuss that at a later date. So this is, what is ChatGPT doing and why does it work? This is the Amazon description. Nobody expected this, not even its creators. ChatGPT has burst onto the scene as an AI capable of writing at a convincingly human level. But how does it really work? What's going on inside its AI mind? In this short book, prominent scientist and computation pioneer Stephen Wolfram provides a readable and engaging explanation that draws on his decades-long unique experience at the frontiers of science and technology. Find out how the success of ChatGPT brings together the latest neural net technology with foundational questions about language and human thought posed by Aristotle more than 2,000 years ago. And this is, of course, written by Stephen Wolfram. This is his Amazon description. Widely known for his discoveries in basic science and his groundbreaking 2002 book, A New Kind of Science, he has spent more than 3 decades building what is now Wolfram language, the knowledge-based computer language that powers Mathematica and Wolfram Alpha, and has contributed to countless inventions and discoveries, as well as to the education of several generations of students. And if you need more of a selling point for why you might want to read this book, I love this quote. This is the best explanation of what ChatGPT is doing that I've seen, by Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI. So I don't know how you get a higher recommendation than that. So Nathan, with that background of the book, I wanted to get your thoughts on what we read this week.
Yeah. So this was the first book that I read in this podcast where I was like, I definitely feel a little out of my element. So
that is absolutely me too.
Full disclosure. I feel like maybe this is what it's like for other people to hear me talk about like cloud computing or software engineering, where I'm like, I'm grasping most of it, but some of it is pretty dense and I'm having to like catch up on it as I go. Like I'm doing research as I'm reading it. So the book was slower to read.
And using ChatGPT as you read it.
Oh my gosh, yeah. ChatGPT, links back to other supplemental material.
Yes.
And so for me, this book was a little slow to start, but I thought the final like 20% was worth the whole time commitment to it. It gave me a solid overview of the fundamentals of neural nets and transformers, and like kind of at a high level understanding how GPT's approach took place. And I think I'd grasped pieces of this before, but Stephen Wolfram just has like a very clear type of writing style that is very much in his style that I think I kind of got, once I got the cadence of how he wrote, it was pretty cool. One of the things, and again, maybe this is me just as an outsider, I'm really, the way that we use language to describe how a system works, maybe this is just the like very cut and dry software engineering background, but there's a lot of language that I've heard him use in this book and others kind of humanize or maybe give a little bit more volition to the abilities of ChatGPT than I think is actually properly attributable. And so we can talk about that more as we get into it, but it would like shake me up a little bit. We're like, oh, this is very human-like or something. And I'm like, we should discuss.
Absolutely. And that was one of my big takeaways from the book too, that this is not a human.
No.
I reading it, ChatGPT is basically one giant math function, which is disgusting. I always joke with my buddy. I think I mentioned him on the podcast before. He's getting a math PhD himself, and so he's a math whiz, and that's always been his strength. He's always kicked my butt at math. But it is crazy to see that something as human language at the end of the day can be generated by what is basically a giant math function. That's insane to me. And that was crazy to read about in this book. Like you, this was my first exposure to neural nets. I've never even taken a class on it. And so to learn how they worked was fascinating. And yeah, just the mathiness of it all was kind of shocking to me. And it reinforced what you were saying. Like, this is not a human. This is not intelligent. This is a very, very sophisticated prediction machine powered by a ton of math. The book is a summary of a summary of a summary, and I still found it incredibly dense. But like I said, it was my first exposure to neural nets and machine learning. That's the first half of the book, is explaining neural nets and machine learning. If you're coming in with a solid background on that, you would probably pick up on this a lot quicker than maybe I did. And I thought it was fascinating. I am getting my master's degree right now through Georgia Tech, their online Masters of Computer Science program. It's actually how Nathan and I met, is through that in a roundabout way. But I'm taking a knowledge-based AI class, and I was shocked at the difference between what I'm learning in this class and how ChatGPT works. I think my class is a little outdated, but I don't think that's because the class is old. I think it's because ChatGPT is, in a way, a huge revolution in how we view artificial intelligence. So it was fascinating. It was fascinating to compare and contrast what I read in the book and what I'm learning in my class. And I would venture a guess what you could learn in any artificial intelligence class at any university these days. I imagine only the most cutting edge universities have classes that deal with large language models like you'll read in this book. Well, Nathan, I really like we talk about on this podcast, we don't want this to be a book report. This is a book club masquerading as a podcast. It's not a book report masquerading as a podcast. If you want to get a full understanding of the book, we encourage you to read the book. But with something like this that is a summary and explainer, we do want to spend a few minutes doing a quick summary of the book, just so we're on the same page. Nathan, before we get into that, is there anything else you wanted to mention as far as general thoughts on the book?
No, I think it makes the most sense to just dive right in.
Okay. Like we said, we are not neural net people. We're not huge machine learning people. This is new to us. We're going to give a summary of what we understand this to be. If you're listening to this and have more expertise and think these guys totally butchered it, this doesn't make any sense at all, please write us at contact@bookoverflow.io and come on the podcast and correct us, because we don't claim to be experts. We are just two software engineers who'd like to learn. So I guess, Nathan, you did something a bit meta here, and you asked ChatGPT to summarize this. And so we'll give the high-level overview of what ChatGPT told us, and then we'll go into our specific notes using quotes from the book. So this is what ChatGPT told us. In What is ChatGPT Doing and Why Does It Work?, Stephen Wolfram explains that ChatGPT is based on a large neural network trained on vast amounts of text data. The core idea is that the model predicts the next word in the sequence, given the context of the previous words. This is achieved through a process called transformer architecture, which allows the model to handle long-range dependencies in text. Wolfram highlights that the model uses statistical patterns learned from the data to generate coherent and contextually relevant responses, simulating human-like conversation. I can attest that's not a hallucination. That is what the book is about. But I also think that if you're familiar with ChatGPT in general, you could tell us that. So let's dive in a bit into a little more detailed explanation of what ChatGPT is and how does it. And we will do that after this quick break. Okay, we're back. If you're familiar with large language models, you will understand that they, like we talked about, they're basically sophisticated guessing machines. ChatGPT looks at all of the words that have come before, tries to guess what the next most probable word is, roughly. I'm using air quotes. This is what Stephen Wolfram says. The first thing to explain is that what ChatGPT is always fundamentally trying to do is produce a reasonable continuation of whatever text it's got so far, where by reasonable, we mean what one might expect to write after seeing what people have written on billions of web pages. So we know that. So basically you can say, okay, given the words the black, what should the third word be? cat, dog, car, house, and ChatGPT comes up. If ChatGPT has that list of probabilistic words, and then it adds the next one, and then it continues that on and on and on and on. I did find this concept fascinating, that ChatGPT has a degree of randomness associated with it called temperature. That basically, if you're always to take the most probabilistic word, you'll wind up with a weird sounding response. This is how Stephen Wolfram explains it. But okay, at each step, it gets a list of words with probabilities. But which one should it actually pick to add to the essay or whatever that it's writing? One might think it should be the highest ranked word, i.e., one to which the highest probability was assigned. But this is where a bit of voodoo begins to creep in. Because for some reason that maybe one day we'll have a scientific style understanding of, if we always pick the highest ranked word, we'll typically get a very flat essay that never seems to show any creativity, and even sometimes repeats word for word. But if sometimes at random we pick lower ranked words, we get a more interesting essay. The fact that there's randomness here means that if we use the same prompt multiple times, we're likely to get different essays each time. And in keeping with the idea of voodoo, there's a particular so-called temperature parameter that determines how often lower ranked words will be used. And for essay generation, it turns out that a temperature of 0.8 seems best. So this is something I didn't realize before. I thought, if ChatGPT is just trained on all the text in the world, how come it's giving me different responses each time? Shouldn't it always be the same response? It's this temperature parameter. There's a degree of randomness built in, and this helps ChatGPT seem more human. And like Stephen says, we don't exactly know why that is. We don't have a scientific understanding. So ChatGPT is trying to do that guessing. And you can imagine that trained on all the text in the world, that you could construct a rough probability table of, okay, I have 2 words, what should the third be? I have 3 words, what should the fourth be? And that given all the text in the human world, you can construct that probability table. You can't. There's too much text. This is how, or too many possibilities. This is how Wolfram explains it. We might imagine that if we were able to use sufficiently long n-grams, that's pairings of words basically, we'd basically get a ChatGPT in the sense that we'd get something that would generate essay length sequences of words with the correct overall essay probabilities. But here's the problem. There just isn't even close to enough English text that's ever been written to be able to deduce those probabilities. In a crawl of the web, there might be a few 100 billion words. In books that have been digitized, there might be another 100 billion words. By the time we get to essay fragments of 20 words, the number of possibilities is larger than the number of particles in the universe. So in a sense, they could never all be written down. So what can we do? The big idea is to make a model that lets us eliminate the probabilities with which sequences should occur, even though we've never explicitly seen those sequences in the corpus of text we've looked at. And the core of ChatGPT is precisely a so-called large language model that's been built to do a good job of estimating those probabilities. So this is where the model and the large language model comes in. It uses a neural net, which we're not really going to go into here because that is a really dense, complicated topic that even the 30 pages or so that are devoted to it here was only enough to get us to barely understand and get up to speed with it. But basically, a neural net, like we said, is a giant math function. It's composed of individual neurons, each running an equation based off the inputs from previous neurons. The neurons have weights associated with them that they can adjust to minimize their loss functions, which tune themselves correctly. It says, this is how Wolfram describes it. Ultimately, every neural net just corresponds to some overall mathematical function, though it may be messy to write out. For the example above, it would be the neural net of ChatGPT also just corresponds to a mathematical function like this, but effectively with billions of terms. And the mathematical function he's referencing was like 8 lines long. So you can imagine how big ChatGPT's math function is. So neural nets function like human brains. We are able to train them. And as we feed an input and tell it what the expected output should be, they adjust those weights on the individual neurons to minimize their loss functions. We don't, and this is something that was fascinating in the book. We don't really know why this works. We just know that it does, and that this helps computers do tasks in a human-like way. There's a lot in this book where Stephen Wolfram is like, yeah, we don't know why this works, but it does, which I thought was fascinating. Okay, so you've got ChatGPT's neural net. It's been trained on everything humanity has ever written. And in a way, it was very easy to train it because we talk about how a neural net, you have to feed in an example and then tell it what the right response should be when it does its final guess. That's kind of easy with text because you can feed it, let's say you have a 10 line or 10 word string. You feed it the first word and say, and hide the rest and say, what should the second be? Okay, now feed it the first 2. Ask what the third should be. Feed it first 3. Ask what the fourth. So in a way, there was a lot of great training data for ChatGPT. Anyway, you do that and you repeat it roughly 1 bajillion times. And that's how you train ChatGPT. So ChatGPT then takes all of the words that have been generated so far in a prompt, and it creates an embedding, which is basically a numerical representation of all those words. That's how Wolfram describes it. But actually, we can go further than just characterizing words by collections of numbers. We can also do this for sequence of words or indeed whole blocks of text. And inside ChatGPT, that's how it's dealing with things. It takes the text it's got so far and generates an embedding vector to represent it. Then its goal is to find the probabilities for different words that might occur next. And it represents its answer for this as a list of numbers that essentially gives the probabilities for each of the 50,000 or so possible words. So again, high level. You feed a paragraph into ChatGPT, turns it into an embedding, a numerical representation. Feed that into the neural net. It pops out another embedding, which is a numerical representation for the next word, token, actually. You feed that back into ChatGPT, do that again and again and again and again and again. And you can imagine how computationally expensive this is because ChatGPT 3 has 175 billion weights, individual neurons. So you have to run these every single time you're generating a token in your text. The magic behind a lot of this is transformers, which is where I got kind of lost. Nathan, do you want to give your best understanding of this?
Yeah. So a little context here is that I think one of the things that I took away from this is GPTs have built on top of a bunch of old ideas with one really powerful new idea, right? So I think the real core of this is that it's reinforcement learning. That is that neural net where we have the layers where the neurons draw out and have these rewards that we do semi-supervised, right? Which is this idea that we feed in the paragraph, a fragment of it, and then try to give it the guessing what the next word's going to be. Yeah. And then, but transformers is this radical idea. And I can give a little anecdote to this as well. And the only reason that transformers have been on the top of mind is that I've worked at a series of AI companies, not as a AI and ML expert, but as an ML ops doing SRE work around supporting these folks. And I actually remember a few years ago, we had a woman, a genius woman she originally was at Meta, and we had hired her to be on our machine learning team. And we were doing like a company offsite, and she goes, there are these things called transformers, and I think it's going to change the industry. Like that was her.
That's
she's
crazy.
Like, we should pay attention to this. And somebody that she had worked with at Meta, I'm pretty sure, I might be butchering this, ended up leaving Meta to go to some startup to like work on this. I don't think it was OpenAI. That would be really cool, but it was someplace. And the idea was that transformers are actually radically simple. They take a lot of the ideas of how these like sort of little neuron functions, but they introduce this idea of attention. And the attention mechanism is really important in how it deals with the context of what it's being asked to evaluate. And I think it was 3 blue, 1 brown that I stole this from. But he talks about the word model. Like the model could be a machine learning model, or it could be like a professional model who walks the runway, right? Mm-hmm. The whole idea with the transformer is that the context around the word model actually fundamentally changes the dimensionality. It changes what the word should be associated with and how it could be correlated with the next best guess. And that it's these deep levels of dimensions. And I think with at least the ChatGPT 3 that we're talking about here, I think it's something like 200 and something dimensions, right? And we have 3 dimensions of space and 1 dimension of time.
Yeah.
So this idea here is like, where is an adjacent correlation with some token, right? We'll pretend it's the word model. Where's the adjacent piece? And then can I go and like project that onto some other section of the neural net and look for the adjacency for a very similar word? And so they talk about things like man and woman having a very similar vector spacing to like king and queen, right? It's like an old classic computer science term. Well, because of the depth of the dimensionality, these transformers can have this attention to focus on these correlations between things in a much more sophisticated way, one that we're struggling to understand. And so you swap out the neural net with these little nodes, these little attention nodes, and then all of a sudden it's seeing relationships and correlations that are mind-boggling to us. That is, I probably have crossed some boundary. There's probably some ML folks that are like, what is he talking about? But this is to me is the the revolutionary part. That's the T in GPT is the
Yes.
transformer. And it was this radically simple idea that took a bunch of, 50, 60 years of ML research and flipped a switch, right? It's all this. I mean, when you're surprising people like Stephen Wolfram, or all these folks that have been working this for years, and they go, wait, large language models can do this. This is you throw enough data at it, and all of a sudden it's like shocking us every time that we do a prompt. So
yeah, you talking about like I think it was like 786 dimensional spaces he was talking about in terms of where words can be located in this map. I was like, 786 dimensions. What does that even mean?
Right.
Fascinating. Yeah. Thank you so much for that explainer on transformers. Honestly, it's making more sense for me now. And I read the book. So that is basically how ChatGPT works. Stephen Wolfram points out that another thing that ChatGPT did that kind of set it apart was they had it do additional training with actual humans. How he describes it, he says, a key idea in the construction of ChatGPT was to have another step after passively reading things like the web, to have actual humans actively interact with ChatGPT, see what it produces, and in fact give it feedback on how to be a good chatbot. But how can the neural net use that feedback? The first step is just to have humans rate results from the neural net. But then another neural net model is built that attempts to predict those ratings. But now this prediction model can be run essentially like a loss function on the original network, in effect allowing that network to be tuned up by the human feedback that's been given. And the results in practice seem to have a big effect on the success of the system in producing human-like output. It was going around on Twitter a while ago, but one way you can tell that something might be written by ChatGPT is it uses the word delve a lot, where we don't use that word. We tend to use dive or dived. I think it's one of those things where I imagine in 10 years, we'll just all be using the word delve a lot. But one reason it does use the word delve a lot is because, from what I've heard, it was trained by Nigerians. ChatGPT hired Nigerians to test it. And since Nigerians use the word delve a lot, and we don't as much in the Western world, that's why it uses delve, which I thought was fascinating. Okay, that is a really high level overview of what ChatGPT is doing and why does it work. Again, this is a summary of a summary of a summary. If you want the full thing, read the book itself. But we are really excited. We're going to talk about some of the interesting ideas we got from this book, and also how, after becoming more familiar with AI and large language models, what are we more excited about in current tech developments, and what are we less excited about for the AI future. We're going to talk about all that and more right after this break. And we're back. Thanks for listening. Okay, like we said, really dense book, lots of learning. We had a ton of fun reading it, even though it was probably our most difficult assignment so far. Right now, we want to talk about some of the interesting ideas from the book, things that really jumped out to us, because Stephen Wolfram, even though it is a summary of what ChatGPT is doing, he pontificates a little more about the state of AI and what ChatGPT might mean, which we found fascinating. Kind of like Nathan said, the last 20% of this book is really interesting. So let's talk about some of those ideas. Nathan, what really jumped out at you first?
Yeah. I think the first thing is the level of mystery. Like no matter how deep we look at the system, there are surprising elements to the very folks who are building it, right? They're like, I don't know why this works, it just does, which to me is deeply unsettling. If I heard a physicist at CERN, doing some particle acceleration, and then they just be like, I have no clue. I have no clue how these are, you're like, okay, we've got a long road ahead of us. And maybe, I think about like other geniuses like Newton, who, intuitively understood how gravity worked and came up with a model of how it worked, but then also still believed until the day he died that he could perform alchemy, that there was some way to turn lead into gold, right? I feel like there's still a little bit of this in the AI world. I think there's a lot of folks who got into this industry because they want human-like intelligence, and that is the end goal. But to me, the much more fascinating thing is that we're building something that's not human.
Yes.
To me, the much more fascinating thing is that, like, and again, the same company where I talked earlier about learning about transformers, the CEO of that company, he's another company now, and he really got the bug for large language models. And he was saying that one of the most amazing things about this is that it's the most performant indexed database system we've ever created, right? You think about this. You can take the entire world's knowledge, you put in a prompt, and then something very, very approximate to the answer you're probably looking for pops out. Sure, maybe it hallucinates, maybe it gets off a little bit, but the fact that we have a database system, if we think of it this way, a database system that gives responses that humans can understand based off of a bunch of relationships, is that this is like nothing we've ever seen. And so the other one is that I have a deeper appreciation, I think, for the fact that we introduced a simpler model, we introduced this transformer, which is this novel idea, and that it revolutionized a bunch of research that we'd been doing up to this point, right? The folks who invented the transformer didn't fundamentally change everything else, all the other work that we've been doing. They changed the approach to how the behavior of a neuron works. And it suddenly, the entire performance of the system just started going exponential, right?
It makes you wonder what technologies we're sitting on today where all of the pieces are there and there's one fundamental innovation missing. And as soon as we come up with that, we'll have another revolutionary product like that. I don't know what it is.
I actually think this is an area that large language models in this whole new world. I mean, we're seeing this also with the protein folding. There's these combinatorial pieces that are emergent where I think the patterns are already there, right? Like, and I do this myself, right? Like, I'm constantly doing this at work. I work in platform engineering. I'm trying to find ways to help our team become more productive. And so I have to look across a bunch of teams and go, what's working here and what's not? Is there a pattern here that I can replicate in this surprising way to this other team? I think that large language models actually do this really well. That's really what these neural nets are really optimized for, is there this relationship between two pieces of data that we as humans can't see easily? It's like finding the needle in the haystack. And I think there's a lot of innovation that's going to come from all the existing stuff we already have, and then piecing together some sort of surprising combination of those.
It's fascinating. So, like we say, we're big readers, and I like to read fiction too in my downtime. And I've actually been really into post-apocalyptic fiction lately. Okay. And one thing that's always strikes me is just like, oh my gosh, if we had to restart society from zero, like all these things we take for granted, right? These people like even trying to like get electricity, right? Which is a huge stepping stone. And looking at this ChatGPT and thinking of everything that had to come before it, right? Like even going back to like electricity, the computer, cloud computing, the internet, right? All of these things all have to come together to make ChatGPT. The foundation for this is astounding. And I know it's fashionable in a lot of circles these days to kind of poo-poo the time we live in and say the world's never been worse. But I just couldn't disagree more. And reading this book, what a time to be alive that we've trained computers to do this. This is insane. I remember when I watched Interstellar like 10 years ago for the first time, and that's a pretty fanciful movie about, all the future technology, right? And I remember seeing TARS and thinking, the robot, and thinking the most unrealistic thing about TARS is how they can talk to him. They can just talk to him like a human, and he responds like a human. Because 10 years ago, we were just barely getting started with like Alexa and Siri and Google Assistant. TARS exists today. ChatGPT is better than TARS. That is insane. Again, what a time to be alive.
Yeah.
Did you want to talk a bit, Nathan, about you had a really interesting take on this, comparing ChatGPT with human children and kind of.
Oh,
yeah. I thought that was fascinating. You'll do it better if you say it.
Yeah. So I've stolen this somewhere from the ether. I can't remember who to attribute it to, but where I'm a bit of a contrarian. I don't think that large language models are putting us on track to have AGI, sure. Or general intelligence.
I think they're really cool too, but I would agree, and we'll talk about that later.
I do think that it will pass the Turing test, and we're gonna have to like change what that means. I think that the idea of how our relationship with these tools emerges, but I'll put it this way: our brain uses I can't remember. I'm gonna probably get it off by a few watts, but pretty close to like what a light bulb uses as far as like energy consumption. And if you look at a child, I have an 8-year-old, and so she learns something new. She has a very small sample size, of training data to learn a new concept, right? There's maybe some repetition, but again, even if she worked on this all day, every day, it would not be, it would be not even a rounding error to the, amount of data that goes into a large language model. And yet she can pick up a concept relatively quickly, right? If you teach her long division, a few days of training, a bunch of example problems, and then she's got it. She's got the core concept. She can run with it. It didn't take all problems in the world in the human lexicon to figure this out. It also didn't take billions of dollars to train the model, which is in my daughter's brain.
Raising kids is expensive, but it's not that expensive.
It's not that expensive. And so to me, there's something fundamentally different there, right? And that's the big point, is that while I do think that large language models are fascinating, and I think that they're doing things that are actually our human brains can't do, and we find very useful, it's fundamentally different. Like, you teach a teenager to drive. It's a few driving lessons on a few weekends. And then whether you should be terrified or not of a 16-year-old driver is a whole other different conversation. But more than not, most 16-year-olds do good enough to drive on the roads. And we're still struggling with this with self-driving cars after billions of dollars in investment and way better sensor data and all these other things that a 16-year-old doesn't have, who's half distracted half the time. And so there's something fundamentally different there. Maybe there's some layers of the neural nets that are somewhat similar, but you also look at our neurons. Our neurons operate at I think it's something like 200 hertz, right? So our neurons are way slower, though I think the connectivity and this sort of reinforcement learning piece, there sounds like there's a lot of inspiration back and forth. And then our sample size is way, way, way smaller. And so when somebody says, "Oh, this is human-like intelligence," or "This is this or that," I really take pause, because I'm like, no, this is fascinating. Humans are captivated by it, but it's fundamentally different.
Yeah, I totally agree. I thought something that really stuck out to me was this idea of human language. And this is something we have assumed to be incredibly complicated for a long time, and yet ChatGPT can do it. What Wolfram posits, and this isn't in contradiction with what you've said about children, they obviously can learn human language with much less processing power and much fewer resources than a computer can. But he proposes that maybe human language is simpler than we think it is. This is how he describes it. He says, there's something potentially confusing about all of this. In the past, there were plenty of tasks, including writing essays, that we've assumed were somehow fundamentally too hard for computers. And now that we see them done by the likes of ChatGPT, we tend to suddenly think that computers must have become vastly more powerful, in particular, surpassing things they were already basically able to do, like progressively computing the behavior of computational systems like cellular automata. But this isn't the right conclusion to draw. Computationally irreducible processes are still computationally irreducible and are still fundamentally hard for computers, even if computers can readily compute their individual steps. And instead, what we should conclude is that tasks like writing essays that we humans could do, but we didn't think computers can do, are actually in some sense computationally easier than we thought. And he goes on to say, my strong suspicion is that the success of ChatGPT implicitly reveals an important scientific fact, that there's actually a lot more structure and simplicity to meaningful human language than we ever knew, and that in the end, there may even be fairly simple rules that describe how much language can be put, or how such language can be put together. I thought that was fascinating. And this kind of goes into that neural net idea that we don't really know what the neural net is doing. Stephen says that so many times, like, we can't really peek inside and get a scientific understanding of what this is doing. It's just doing what the neural net does. And that's what he proposes, that in the same way that we have neural nets that can tell you if a picture is a dog or a cat, and we can't really describe as humans how we know something is a dog or a cat, but the computer can do it. There's some underlying rules to what separates a dog from a cat. He's also saying that there may be a lot more underlying rules to grammar and sentence structure and language than we think. I don't know. It kind of blew my mind that there are possibly rules to language that undergird all of human language that we have not identified, but they must exist because a computer can generate human language. I don't know. It's crazy.
No, this is so I do think that this is where those feedback loops are really cool. I think Wolfram is correct there, most likely, that there is some simple piece. And again, our hardware in our brain is 200 hertz. This is highly connected neural net that's happening. Something there can emerge from our brain cells. And a child who doesn't understand how most of the world works understands what their parents' face looks like, things like that. Um, I do also think that there's something really interesting about grammar. I'm a big fan of Noam Chomsky. I know that he's like a very like political
Sure.
person, but he also is a linguist, and I think
Uh-huh.
he actually has a really interesting article that came out recently on why he doesn't think that this is taking us to AGI. But years ago, I think it was like 2013, there was a documentary I saw called "Is the Man Who Is Tall Happy?" And it was about a conversation with Noam Chomsky about language. And it was talking about that sentence. And this would be really fascinating to see. Is the man who is tall happy? Was a sentence that confused AI, at least, especially in 2013, because the
Uh-huh.
context there is, as humans, we actually can pick this out really easily. But there's like these correlation pieces of, well, is he happy because he is tall? Or are we just describing about picking the person out of the crowd that this is the tall man? Is he happy? Like we can kind of
Uh-huh.
like figure out the context really quickly, and computers up to that point had a really hard time with it. And so the grammar was this thing that he argued was, he called this thing called the universal grammar, that maybe what we have is a pre-trained model deeply embedded in our brains. And so therefore, the billions of dollars that I criticized earlier, maybe this is, generations of, human evolution or something that kind of pre-train the model. And then we just kind of like pick on top of it. Who knows? It's fascinating to think about. So
Yeah, this book has so many interesting ideas. Again, the first 80% of it is laying the foundation for, I think the first 80% of it was written so that Stephen Wolfram could write the last 20%. I think that's what he really wanted to write, was the last
yeah,
20%. But he is kind enough to write the first 80% and explain how ChatGPT is working. And then he kind of gets a little philosophical about it. We've
yeah,
just talked about some of those philosophical ideas, which are absolutely fascinating. I feel like I'm a broken record, but if you want the full understanding of what Stephen is talking about, read the book. Even just read the last 20%. And actually, you don't even have to read the book. I paid $8 for the Kindle version because I love my Kindle. This is freely available on his website as an essay. So you can
right.
just go on there right now. But yes, fascinating ideas in this book. We are going to take a quick break. After the break, we are going to talk about, now that we've read this book and are a little more knowledgeable about AI and how it works, what are we more excited about in the current tech landscape, and what are we less excited about? All of that after the break. And we are back. Thank you so much for listening. It's been an interesting episode. Like we say, we don't usually discuss books that are so focused on one particular tech and one particular topic like this, but it is great conversation fodder. And I think it shows that there is so much that can be gained from reading any book about technology and really thinking deeply about it. Um, Kind of in that spirit, as we've thought deeply about this book and I've kind of assimilated this knowledge about how AI works into our worldview, we want to talk a little bit about how our thoughts have changed on the current tech landscape. And let's start with, what are we more excited about in AI after having read Stephen Wolfram's work? Nathan, what excites you more?
I'm excited about getting past the hype machine. And I mean that in the sense that I think we've captured the world's imagination with ChatGPT, and now it's time to do the hard work, right? The skeptics, the pessimists, they need to be heard. And I'm really excited to see at the level of scrutiny that the public is now putting on these, what comes out of that. So I guess that's my first take.
Absolutely. Something I'm more excited about reading this is the idea of large action models. If you've been following uh, I guess I'll call it a disaster. The Rabbit R1. If you've been following that whole saga, if you don't watch the YouTuber CoffeeZilla, he had a great video recently about R1 and how the large action model might just be a big scam. But let's talk about, if you're not familiar with what a large action model is, it's in the same way as like a large language model, is this idea that we might be able to train a model to instead of thinking in words and text, to think in actions you could take on a computer. So for example, I tell right now how Siri works, right? If I say, order me some food on DoorDash, is that Siri has kind of hard coded into it it knows how to play with DoorDash's API, right? And so it can parse out from in my first internship, I actually did a lot of work with natural language processing. So basically it parses out from what you said, it grabs, okay, food provider, DoorDash, meal, McDonald's, or I guess restaurant, McDonald's, meal, hamburger, right? And it packages all that up and then uses the DoorDash API to make that request, right? Large action model proposes that instead of using APIs, we just interact with the computer in the way that humans do. So if I say, order me a hamburger from McDonald's, the large action model knows, okay, normally when people order a hamburger from McDonald's, what do? They go to DoorDash.com. They search for McDonald's. They click on the McDonald's widget. They scroll. They find hamburger. They click. They add to cart. They check out, right? And it performs all of those actions for us. I think that's a fascinating idea. I love the idea that one day we could work like that. I always say that the ideal robot would be like a floating pair of hands, because that's how every interface is built for humans, because we're hands. And so if you could have a floating pair of hands, it could open your fridge, it could lift your laundry basket, it could turn on the washing machine. You wouldn't have to build any special pathways for the robot. It could just interact with everything the way that we do. And that's kind of the same with like a large action model, is that you don't need to build these APIs out. You could just interact with the app in the same way that a human does. I think a lot of this depends on how computationally shallow this is. We discovered with ChatGPT that constructing human language is roughly, it's more computationally shallow than we thought. I don't know if constructing a large action model like that is. If you could have a neural net that's basically trained on, instead of a token, you can think of an action. And so you think, okay, someone goes to DoorDash.com. What is the next most likely action they take after going to DoorDash.com? Yeah.
This is really fascinating. I just had this idea. So, talk me off the ledge if I'm
that's what this podcast is for.
So imagine, one of the problems that like the Rabbit R1 had issues with is, number one, it was, I saw the CoffeeZilla stuff too. And it looks like it's, classic charlatan, overhyped stuff. Imagine, what if the interface that we're missing here is that we actually need reciprocal prompts? And so, I think about this in the sense that, like, instead of the Rabbit R1 trying to use the user interface for DoorDash, what if DoorDash also exposed a prompt? And so they could actually have a conversation with each other.
Oh, interesting.
And that was, so you imagine, like where we got a lot of the flexibility with things like GraphQL, where I didn't have to know exactly how the data is structured on the back end. I could like request a data structure and it would kind of do it. Mm-hmm. Imagine, and I'm bringing this back because I used to do work for a venture capital firm. I've been all over the place doing all kinds of scrappy stuff. And one of the big superpowers that the managing partners and the partners have at a venture capital firm are these highly intelligent, highly trained executive assistants. I mean, these are folks that have typically higher degrees, probably even master's degrees, but can actually read the minds of the managing partner or whomever who needs to like do some crazy stuff, last minute bookings, coordinating schedules with other busy executives. And they're constantly on the phone, constantly emailing and on the phone and doing basically what we're trying to do with the Rabbit R1. Imagine if we basically had a prompt engineered version for ourselves of this executive assistant that could then talk to other executive assistants from other systems. So they literally are chit-chatting back and forth, trying to figure out the best way to say, I just want a hamburger, right? And so like McDonald's actually ends up having, or DoorDash ends up having like an amazing prompt who is protected enough and understands the context of a customer and does these other things. But that's really funny to think about, the fact that like we might actually have computers just like chit-chatting to each other.
Yeah. I like that future better. What was it? The CEO of Bumble proposed that like we'll have AI versions of ourselves talking to each other, going on dates and like filtering out. Like that was creepy. But I don't mind if my computers are ordering hamburgers by having a nice conversation.
The funny thing is that we do, I mean, high power executives have been doing this for a very long time. It's like, what, you don't go talk to Warren Buffett. You talk to Warren Buffett's executive assistant, right? And that's the boundary about before they let a direct communication go through. So that's really, That's interesting. I hadn't thought of it in the perspective of what you were bringing up here until I'm like, man, what if that's the direction we end up going? Is these like highly, again, it's this attention idea that when I say I want a hamburger, maybe, the context is the prompt understands what I mean by hamburger. It means like hold the
Uh-huh.
onions or this or that. And so I just say I want a hamburger, but it knows, okay, well, I actually want this very particular type of hamburger, and I know which hamburger place to go to. And like it over time picks up all of these things.
The transformation at the end, I think, is I don't know how that works, because again, they can have this conversation back and forth, and ultimately they arrive to, okay, what does he want? He wants a hamburger, no pickles, from McDonald's, delivered at this time, right? But then how do you take that human language sentence and turn it into actions that the system knows how to take to actually get the hamburger scheduled in McDonald's ordering queue?
Right.
I don't know how that works. That's why I think a large action model could be interesting, because in the same way that now how we talk to ChatGPT, we don't have to, it's not like Alexa where you had to have kind of specific commands to trigger things. You can just talk to ChatGPT like a human. In the same way, your computer might not have to have specific commands to order a hamburger. It just orders a hamburger like a human would. But this kind of gets me into my less excited about AI, which is, how would you even get the data to train a large action model like that? You'd have to have a huge collection of tracking users' swipes and inputs and things like that. Who are the only people in the world who could get that data? Apple, Google, and Microsoft, the people who own our devices. And this is what makes me a little less excited about the future of AI. Some people have been talking about this already, which is, it seems to be a massive benefit to incumbents. I don't think, I would love to be proven wrong here. Thus far, AI and large language models, it doesn't feel to me like the invention of the iPhone and the modern smartphone, where this prompted a lot of upstarts that upsetted the market and introduced a lot of innovation. I'm thinking about companies like Uber and Airbnb, apps that fundamentally could not exist without the smartphone. Well, Airbnb maybe, but Uber you could not have unless you had the smartphone. Even things like social media apps like Twitter and Facebook and Instagram would not be where they are today because of, or without the smartphone. And that upsetting the market, what, not only was it really great for innovation and consumers, it was really great for employees too. There was actually, it was a big class action lawsuit years ago where the big tech companies like Apple and Microsoft and Google and Adobe, they all had agreements with each other not to poach each other's employees, which is like super illegal. And so it artificially kept tech compensations lower than they should be. But then Facebook comes onto the scene, young upstart, ready to upset. They don't have these agreements. They're not part of the old boys club, right? And so they need to attract these world-class engineers. So what do? They start paying way more and they start poaching. And so not only does it kind of trigger this lawsuit, but it raises tech compensations dramatically. I don't know if AI is going to have that same effect. I don't know if we're going to really see, maybe there'll be new AI model players. Like obviously OpenAI is now a big name, which wasn't before. Maybe Anthropic will become really big and that will increase competition with Google and Microsoft and whatnot. But I am skeptical that we'll see a really big like business to consumer AI play. It is just way too expensive to train these models. This is how Stephen Wolfram puts it. He says, when we run ChatGPT to generate text, we're basically having to use each weight once. So if there are n weights, we've got of order n computational steps to do. Though in practice, many of them can be typically done in parallel on GPUs. But if we need about n words of training data to set up those weights, then from what we've said above, we can include that we'll need about n squared computational steps to do the training of the network, which is why with current efforts, one ends up needing to talk about billion-dollar training efforts. AI, I mean, I think it's going to build us a lot of cool products that are going to live in our iPhones and our Androids. I don't know how much it's going to help a young new company upset the established order. And I don't know, that's just, it's not necessarily a bad thing, but I think one of the great things about tech is how much of like a Wild West frontier it's been.
Right.
And it's strange to have a big development come along like this that does seem fundamentally different from like the invention of the smartphone, the invention of the internet, the invention of the personal computer. I don't know how much this is going to shake up the big market players. I'd love to be wrong though.
Yeah. I also worry, I'm a big security and privacy advocate. It's really been disorienting to me that a very small number of players have convinced a population to post very intimate details to a system that also reserves the right to train future models with the data that you're uploading. And I know that there are business agreements. I know that there's companies like Apple that are trying to de-identify and really kind of contain the privacy components. But there's lots of folks that I think if you condition them to use these prompts, and you've also conditioned them not to think about the implications of using these, we're actually changing fundamental societal behaviors that are building a very Orwellian world upon which, if a certain power player in the future decided to abuse the system, to preempt bad behavior, do some of the stuff that's in some of the sci-fi movies that we've seen, it's not outlandish to think that this could actually be abused as a system of control, right? And I think we should worry about that, right? If only a small number of players can train multi-billion-dollar models and they cozy up with governments, and that government one day becomes adversarial against its citizens, you could see how this is a really bad relationship, right?
Yeah.
Some very intimate, because you also imagine like your Bill of Rights don't apply towards asking for your prompt history. Like where again, if you had a personal assistant, they also can say, "I plead the fifth," right? I have protections against self-incrimination. But if your personal assistant is a prompt history and attention tokens on OpenAI, and OpenAI wants to continue to do business in whatever government is compelling it to disclose, those are real questions that we should worry about. I think those are the things more than like even do large language models cause harm? These kind of things. There's a societal component that we really haven't sorted out. It's very disorienting.
It's a brave new world we live in. I think, yeah. After having read this book, it was comforting to come away and kind of be like what you said, Nathan. This isn't intelligent. It's not human. It is ultimately a guessing machine. And I like you said, after reading this book, I am much less confident in reaching an AGI anytime soon. I was never kind of a big AGI will be here soon. I think we are seeing. I can't believe I can't remember the name of the math function, but the one that is really steep and then plateaus. What do they call that? Logarithmic?
Logistics, logistic curve. Are you talking about?
Yeah, something like that. I don't know. Math people, tell us what we got wrong. But I think we've seen a really big advance, and I think we're gonna flatten out roughly. Still, really, really fascinating to take a peek behind the curtain with this book. We always like to talk about in this podcast is what are we going to do differently in our career as a result of having read the book. This book is a little different because it's not as straight technical advice as we get in the books we usually read, but still, you can learn something from everything. And the point of this podcast is to improve our craft as software engineers. So why don't you tell us, Nathan, what are you going to do differently in your career?
Yeah, I've shied away from diving into any of the nitty gritty details of neural nets or large language models or GPT. And I think this book was a great icebreaker for me to actually have more confidence that say, sure, maybe I'm a newbie, maybe I'm a beginner, but I can take time and try to start wrapping my mind around these crucial technologies that we're structuring society around in a lot of ways. If nothing else, so that I can speak intelligently with my reservations, right? And so that's what I want to do with the results of this book, is to maybe spend some more time paying attention to this industry and the details that are around it.
Yeah, totally agree. A big takeaway for me too was I want to be more curious about the tools I'm using. For example, I use Git every day. I don't know how Git works on the inside. I have a rough understanding of the theory, but how long would it take to find a paper or a summary, or even though it's a bit of sacrilege in this podcast, a video explaining Git? It'd probably take 20 minutes to read that. And then I'd be more informed as an engineer. And I think it's good to know why the tools we're using work. And yeah, I just like to be better about that, being a little more curious about the things I use every day, even things like multi-touch on my phone. That's a huge technology, change the world. How does that work? I don't know. It probably wouldn't take very long to find out. And I hope by building that knowledge base, it'll make me more developed as a person. But hopefully, as you start planting those seeds and becoming more well-versed in these different interesting ideas, you'll see the connections between them and it'll lead to a more holistic way of thinking. That's my hope, at least.
I love that.
Great. Well, we always like to say who we would recommend this book to at the end of this podcast. Nathan, who would you recommend? What is ChatGPT Doing and Why Does It Work by Stephen Wolfram?
Okay. This will be the first out of all the books, but for the general reader, I would not recommend this book. At least not as your first foray into ChatGPT. I think that there's actually superior sources these days, and maybe this didn't exist back when this book first came out. But Andres Karpathy, Byte Go, 3 Blue, 1 Brown, YouTube videos, actually, and they're long form. They're not just like 5-minute explanations. They were incredible supplemental, and I think if I had started with that before reading this book, probably would have been a good start. Who I would recommend this book for are folks who are just general fans of Stephen Wolfram. His perspectives on the world are fascinating. I don't always agree with them, but I always respect them. And there's no difference here. So, he's been a prolific voice in the industry. And if you want to have his understanding of ChatGPT, this is an amazing book for that.
Totally agree. I would recommend this book to anyone who is extremely interested in AI and large language models. I am casually interested in them. And to be totally honest, if it weren't for the fact that we do this podcast, I might have put this book down. Not because it isn't well written, but just because I am not a neural net guy. And I had trouble. And it took a lot of supplementary research to prepare this podcast and to have an understanding of what this book was talking about. This is our shortest book we've ever read. It's about 100 pages. And I think it's still the most time I've ever poured into a reading assignment for this podcast. This is the beginning of the podcast. We'll see how that stands. I have a feeling that this episode might become somewhat legendary amongst Nathan and I as being
it's
very cognitively demanding.
It's the new comparison. We're like, okay, was easier or more difficult than the density of how does a ChatGPT work?
We're reading now Fundamentals of Software Architecture, which is a great book, but I'm like, my gosh, this is so much easier to digest. And it says a lot when a book called Fundamentals of Software Architecture feels so much easier to digest than this book. So if you're super, super interested in AI and large language models and just really passionate about the subject matter and willing to do the work to really understand what this is saying, totally pick this up. It's a great summary of ChatGPT. Again, Sam Altman himself says it's the best one there is. But if you're more casually interested, I would recommend, one, listening to this podcast. And if you made it at this point in this podcast, then you have listened to the whole thing. Or checking out those videos that Nathan recommended, because I think that's probably more the amount of depth you're looking for in your understanding of ChatGPT. Well, I've had a ton of fun this episode. We were a little nervous about how it would go because it's a little different from what we've done before, but it was at least a blast on our end recording it. Hopefully you had a fun time listening to it. Would you agree, Nathan?
Yeah, this was great. I feel a little more confident on getting into these like sort of deep dive topics in the future. I've actually thrown some other books in our backlog that I think would be kind of cool, not on GPTs, but things like graph theory and some other stuff that I think affect us as software engineers, but maybe we haven't spent the time looking at the more mathy side of stuff.
And when I saw those books enter the backlog, I already knew that Nathan was a bit of a masochist because he agreed to join a podcast where you read 200 pages a week. But then he threw in these extra books and I'm like, oh my gosh, he wants more. So but I'm excited to tackle them too, because I think part of the reason we read these books is to push ourselves. And if nothing else, having read this book, it's kind of something I can hang my hat on and say, hey, if I do nothing else in this life, I read what is ChatGPT doing and why does it work, and roughly understood it. And that's an accomplishment in and of itself.
That's awesome.
Well, thank you so much for listening. We really enjoyed the book. We really enjoy having you listen. We are just so flattered and excited that so many people have tuned in. We're just beginning. We're still small, but we thank you who are listening thus far. And really hope you'll stick along with us. And please, you can contact us at contact@bookoverflow.io. If you want to be a guest on the podcast, contact us at guests@bookoverflow.io. You can find us on Twitter. We are Book Overflow Pod. On YouTube, we are also Book Overflow Pod. And on YouTube, please comment, like, subscribe. We'd love to hear from you. And like I said, your input here could make a big impact on how the podcast goes. Nathan also hosts his own podcast once a month called Functionally Imperative. Please check that out. What is that? Funk Imp? Is that the...
Yeah, Funk Imp. It's a little more out there. I interview folks about what I call autotelic pursuits, or people who do things for the intrinsic value of it. So these are technical and creative folks. So yeah.
Nathan releases that once a month. So again, if you are already impressed that we're reading 200 pages a week, just know that Nathan also has another podcast he does. We are busy folks. Yes, please contact us, like, subscribe. We'd love to hear from you. And thank you so much for tuning in. We look forward to having you back next week.
See ya.